She had learned to live in darkness long before they took her eyes. The courtroom was cold stone and cruelty, but Sarah heard it all, the gavels fall like a death knell, the Alpha Council's verdict whispered in tongues she'd memorized since childhood. Blind Omegas were liability, broken bloodlines, cursed wombs. The law had always whispered this, and today it roared. Execution at dawn, by order of the crown. Her hands, bound in silver chains that burned against her skin, trembled not from fear but from something deeper, a knowing that had no name. She'd been born without sight, but her other senses had grown teeth. She could smell fear 7 rooms away. She could taste copper in the air when death approached. And right now, she could hear the heartbeat of the judge who'd condemned her, rapid, guilty, afraid. Fear meant something was wrong. Fear meant mercy had a pulse somewhere in this castle. They dragged her down spiral stairs worn smooth by centuries of condemned footsteps. The dungeon smelled of iron and straw, of time rotting in darkness. Sarah had spent so long in her own darkness that this felt like coming home. She knelt on the stone floor, her white dress, the ceremonial garment of the condemned, spread like a ghost around her. She waited for dawn, but dawn never came alone. The dungeon door shattered inward with such force that the chain securing her to the wall sang like a bell. Sarah's head snapped toward the sound. Her ears caught him first, a breathing pattern, heavy and controlled, the breath of a man trained to survive. Then his heartbeat, loud and steady as war drums, echoing through the stone chamber. It was a rhythm she'd never heard before, not racing with violence, not pounding with panic. It was the heartbeat of someone carrying an impossible weight, of a man walking toward his own ruin with eyes wide open. "Leave her," a voice commanded. Granite and moonlight fused into sound. The guards scattered like rats before a wolf. Sarah remained motionless, her sightless eyes turned toward the darkness that had a shape now, broad-shouldered, radiating heat like a dying fire. She could smell him, snow and blood and something ancient, something that made her Omega blood sing with recognition even as her reason screamed warning. "I came for the condemned," he said, "but I didn't expect." He stopped. His heartbeat changed, not faster, but heavier, as if something in his chest had shifted, as if gears had clicked into place. "Your Majesty," she whispered, and she didn't know how she knew. She only knew his heartbeat had become her compass, and it was pointing toward something neither of them could deny. The Alpha King reached out, and for the first time in her life, Sarah felt the touch of a hand that didn't recoil from her blindness. His fingers found her cheek with the gentleness of prayer. "What is your name?" he asked. "Sarah." "Sarah," he repeated, and in that single word she heard the breaking of 1,000 laws, the beginning of a war, and the sound of fate's loom spinning faster. "I came to set a prisoner free," he said, "but I think I've come to lose myself instead." His heartbeat quickened then, just once, a single staccato of panic before he steadied himself again. That one moment told her everything. This man was afraid, not of her, of what she meant, of what choosing her would cost. Sarah stood, her chains falling away. Somehow, they were already unlocked. "Then we are both condemned," she said. "The only question is whether we face the dawn together or alone." The Alpha King's heartbeat answered before his lips did. It was the answer she'd been waiting for since birth, the rhythm of recognition, of a man choosing mercy in a kingdom that had forgotten its meaning. "Come," he said, and extended his hand. "We have a war to start." The night became their kingdom. They rode through snow that fell like ash, 2 figures carved from storm and desperation. Sarah's fingers gripped the saddle, reading the ground beneath the horse's hooves through vibrations that traveled up her arms. She needed no eyes to know the terrain. Her other senses had become prophecy. Behind them, the castle burned with torches. The Alpha King's betrayal was already spreading like wildfire through the northern territories. He had stolen a condemned woman. He had defied the council. He had chosen damnation over duty. His name was Kyle. She learned it from the way the wind spoke it. Kyle, 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 a name carved from old wars and older sorrows. They rode until the horses faltered, until the snow came up to their thighs, and the world became nothing but white silence. The Alpha King, Kyle, pulled her from the saddle and carried her toward a structure she could hear before she could feel it. A cave mouth, exhaling cold air like the breath of something ancient. "We rest here," he said, and his heartbeat told her he was calculating odds, running through betrayals, measuring the cost of his choice. He built a fire from dead wood and dried moss, and Sarah sat close enough to feel its warmth without feeling its bite. The cave smelled of stone, centuries old, and something else. A scent that made her Omega blood respond with recognition. Another wolf had sheltered here, someone powerful, someone who'd also run. "Why did you come?" she asked. Kale was quiet for a long time. She could hear him breathing, could trace the pattern of his heartbeat as it rose and fell. Finally, he spoke. "The council ordered me to sign the execution. My sister, Lyra, served on the tribunal. She said you were too dangerous, an Omega with gifts the blind shouldn't possess, that your senses made you unpredictable." He paused. I asked her what gift she meant, and she wouldn't say. So I went to the dungeon myself, to understand what they feared so badly they needed you dead. His voice lowered. And then I felt it. Felt what? "The absence of my curse," he said quietly. "I've carried a wound for 7 years, Sarah, a hex placed on my bloodline by a seer I once betrayed. It eats at me from the inside, makes me hollow, makes me dangerous to anyone who gets close." He turned toward her, and she heard the vulnerability in his breathing. "But when I walked into that dungeon and saw you, the pain stopped. For the first time in 7 years, the wound went silent." Sarah's hands trembled. She understood then what she was. Not just an Omega, a healer, a pathfinder. Someone born to recognize the broken and make them whole again. "They were going to execute you because you were meant to save me," Kale continued. "The council saw that gift and called it a threat." She reached toward him, her fingers finding the steady pulse of his heart. It beat beneath her palm like a promise, like a second heartbeat she was borrowing to stay alive. "I can't save you," she whispered. "I can only walk with you." "That's enough," he said. "That's more than enough." They sat through the night, her hand on his heart, his fingers tracing the contours of her face as if learning a language written in bone and shadow. There was no passion in it yet, only recognition. Only the terrible knowledge that they had been born for this moment, that the universe had been patient and cruel enough to keep them apart until the exact second they needed each other. When dawn came, they moved again. The mountains rose before them like the teeth of the earth itself. Kyle guided her horse with his own, their voices the only sound besides wind and hoofbeats. Sarah had learned to navigate by the rhythm of his heartbeat, by the way the air changed when he tensed with fear or relaxed with certainty. They were building a language without words. "There's a place," he said as they climbed, "north of the territories the council controls, a temple older than the kingdom. The seers built it when they still honored the old magic." "What will we find there?" Sarah asked. "Answers or death? Perhaps both." The temple revealed itself through sound first. The wind found 1,000 hollow places and sang through them like ghosts. Kyle lifted Sarah from her horse and carried her up steps that seemed to rise forever. The air changed as they climbed, became thinner, more electric. She could taste copper again. Destiny. Inside, the stone breathed. That was the only way to describe it. The temple's heart beat in time with her own heartbeat, with Kale's heartbeat, with something vast and lunar and ancient. Sarah's fingers found symbols carved into the walls, spirals, circles, the outline of a wolf with a woman's face. "The Pathfinder," Cale whispered. "The old texts speak of her. A woman born without sight who could see the true heart of things, who could recognize the wounded and make them whole. The legend says she was the mate to the first Alpha King, and that together they created the bond between wolf and woman that made our kingdom strong." "Am I her?" Sarah asked. "No," Kyle said, and his heartbeat was certain. "You are the next one, the one born to save this kingdom from itself." He took her hands and pressed them against his chest. Beneath her palms, she felt it, the wound. It was like a knot of shadow, a place where light refused to go, the hex that had eaten at him for 7 years. "Heal me," he whispered, and his heartbeat begged and demanded at once. Sarah closed her eyes, though they had been closed her entire life, and reached deeper. Her omega blood responded, singing with a frequency only he could hear. She felt the hex unwind, felt the shadow dissolve beneath her touch. Light rushed in like floodwater, and Kyle gasped as if remembering what it meant to be whole. When she released him, he was weeping. "Thank you," he said against her hair. "Thank you for choosing me. Thank you for being real." They stood in the temple as the night deepened. 2 broken things made whole by proximity, by choice, by the terrible grace of recognition. Outside, the storm gathered. Inside, they were safe. But safety, Sarah knew, was always temporary. "The council won't stop," she said. "No," Kyle agreed. "They'll send hunters. They'll call us heretics and traitors. They'll burn every village that shelters us." "And what will you do?" His heartbeat told her the answer before his voice did. "I will build a new kingdom," he said. "One where the blind can see, where omegas rule alongside alphas, where the council's laws are ashes. I will do it because you came into my darkness, Sarah. I will do it because you are the reason I remember what mercy looks like." She found his mouth in the darkness and kissed him, and in that moment, the temple began to glow, pale and silver, moonlight made manifest. "And now, I invite you to leave a trace of your presence in the comments. Tell us where in the world you're watching from, and the exact hour you hear this story. We wish to know how far these northern confessions travel, and at what moments of the night they find you. They never stayed in one place long enough for the hunters to catch their scent." Cale moved through the northern territories like a ghost, remembering how to haunt, leading her through forests where the snow was so deep that sound itself seemed to drown. Behind them, the council's wolves tracked relentlessly. Sarah could hear them on the wind, their howls distorted by distance but growing closer each night. "How many?" she asked, as they rode through a ravine where the stone sides blocked the worst of the wind. 50 wolves, perhaps more. My brother Castor leads them." Kyle's voice was hollow when he spoke his brother's name. He always was loyal to the council before he was loyal to me. Sarah reached over and found his hand. His heartbeat was steady, but she could taste the betrayal in his blood, could feel the weight of fraternal love twisted into something sharp and poisonous. "Will you kill him?" she asked. "If I have to," Cale said. "But I would rather he remember what honor looks like." They found shelter in a village of outcasts, women cast out for being born wrong, men who'd refused to serve the council, children whose parents had been executed for treason. Cale's appearance caused whispers, but Sarah's blindness caused something else. Recognition. Hope. They gathered around her as if she might see into their souls, might tell them they were meant for something more than exile. An old woman, scarred and weathered, brought Sarah tea that tasted of starlight and grief. "You're the one the council wanted dead," the woman said. It wasn't a question. "Yes. Good. They fear what they don't understand, and they don't understand redemption." The woman pressed something into Sarah's hand, a pendant on a thin silver chain. This belonged to a seer who lived 300 years ago. She could see the threads of fate. She said the next pathfinder would recognize herself by the weight of this around her neck. Sarah felt the pendant. It was warm, impossibly warm, and shaped like a crescent moon with a drop of blood at its center. "Wear it," the woman said. "Let them see what you are. Let them understand that you're not a threat. You're a resurrection." That night, Kale found her in the village shrine, a simple room with a hearth and symbols carved into stone. "The hunters are close," he said. "We'll need to move at dawn." "No," Sarah said, and something ancient spoke through her voice. "We face them here. We face them now." Kale's heartbeat spiked with alarm. "Sarah, there are 50, and we are 2, she said. She stood, and as she did, the pendant around her neck began to glow. "But I am something they've never seen, and you are something they've forgotten how to fear." She walked to him and took his face between her hands. "Show them what mercy looks like, Kyle. Show them that an Alpha King can choose his Omega not because the laws demand it, but because his heart recognizes her as home." He kissed her then, tasting destiny, tasting the future they would either build together or burn defending. When he pulled away, his eyes were alight with something that had nothing to do with firelight. "Then we meet them as equals," he said, "not as fugitives, as the future." The hunters came at dawn, 50 wolves in human form, their eyes golden with bloodlust and obedience. Castor emerged from their midst, a mirror image of his brother, but where Kale carried his strength like a burden, Castor wore it like a crown. He saw Kale and his expression twisted with something between sorrow and contempt. "Brother," Castor called, "come back to the kingdom. Renounce this cursed Omega, and I will convince the council to spare your life." Kyle stepped forward, and Sarah heard the crunch of snow beneath his boots, each step deliberate, each step a choice. "The council sentenced her to death for being what she is," Kale said. "I will not renounce the only true thing I've ever known." "She has bewitched you," Castor spat. "The seer's curse has poisoned your mind." "The curse is broken," Kyle said, "and it was broken not by magic, but by recognition. By an Omega who walked into my darkness and showed me that I was worth saving." Sarah stepped forward then. Her white dress was no longer the raiment of the condemned. It was a shroud of light, the pendant at her throat glowing like a fallen star. She walked until she stood beside Kyle, and though she could not see, every wolf in that valley knew they were witnessing something beyond their understanding. "I am not bewitchment," she said, and her voice carried to the mountain peaks. "I am what your kingdom was built on and what your council has forgotten. I am the Pathfinder. And I have come to ask you a question, Castor, son of the North. Do you choose loyalty to a law that makes orphans of the innocent, or do you choose the harder path of mercy?" Castor's heartbeat was a storm. She could hear it even from 10 paces away, the rhythm of a man at war with himself, of a brother remembering what he'd sworn to forget. "If I let you pass," Castor said slowly, "the council will execute me." "Yes," Sarah said, "but you will have saved a kingdom that doesn't deserve saving yet. You will have chosen what's right over what's safe. Isn't that worth the price?" For a long moment, there was only wind and the sound of 50 wolves holding their breath. Then Castor knelt. "Forgive me, brother," he said, and behind him, one by one, the hunters lowered their weapons. Kyle reached down and pulled his brother to his feet, and they embraced in the snow with the kind of love that could only be born from betrayal and redemption. When they separated, Castor's eyes were wet, and he was smiling. "Go north," Castor said. "There are villages in the mountains that have already stopped following the council. Gather them. Build your new kingdom, brother, and when it's time, I will bring an army to make sure it stands." The hunters dispersed like morning mist. Kyle and Sarah were alone on the mountain, and the sun broke through the clouds like it had been waiting for permission. We did it, Sarah whispered. We're just beginning, Kyle said, and he took her hand. Come, our people are waiting. The village of Northmark became their headquarters, a place where the broken gathered like pilgrims seeking sanctuary. Word spread through the mountains and valleys that the blind Omega and the cursed Alpha King had found each other, and that together they were building something new. Refugees came daily, Omegas cast out for being too strong, Alphas stripped of rank for showing mercy, children born with gifts the council had marked for death. Kyle moved through the village with purpose, planning defenses and forging alliances with the northern clans. But every evening, he returned to Sarah. She sat by the hearth in their stone cottage, her fingers always moving, weaving. She wove patterns that seemed to have no beginning and no ending, threads of silver and gold and deep crimson. The pendant at her throat pulsed with soft light, as if powered by her heartbeat. "What do you see when you weave?" Kyle asked one night, sitting beside her. "The future," she said simply, "not as images, as patterns. Right now the threads are tangling. There's a knot coming, something that will test everything we've built." "War? Worse," she said. "Choice. Someone we love will have to choose between what's easy and what's right. And I can't see which way they'll fall." Kyle took her hands, stopping the motion of her weaving. In the firelight, her sightless eyes seemed to contain galaxies. "Tell me what I can do," he said. "What you've already done," she whispered. "Love me, choose me. When everything falls apart, remember that you chose this, that you chose us." He kissed her then, deep and slow, tasting the prophecy in her mouth. They moved to their bed in the back of the cottage, and their bodies spoke the language their hearts had learned in that dungeon, a language of recognition, of two halves finally made whole. Later, as he held her in the darkness, Kale heard it, the war horn of the council, sounding from the western pass. They had finally come with an army. "Comment Luna if you'd walk through the storm for someone who saw your worth." The battle was not what anyone expected. The council's army came with fire and fury, 10,000 strong, their war cries shaking loose the snow from the mountain peaks. Kyle stood at the village gates with his people, 2,000 warriors born from desperation and hope. By all measures, they should have been slaughtered. But Sarah stood beside him, and as the enemy approached, she began to sing. It wasn't music in any language they knew. It was older than words, deeper than sound. It was the language of the Pathfinder, the ancient song that the first woman to bear that name had used to bind wolf and woman into the first pack. As she sang, Kale felt something shift inside him, felt his human form begin to blur at the edges, felt the wolf self that he'd kept caged rise up with recognition. All around the village, his people transformed. Omegas and Alphas both, their human forms giving way to their true natures. Wolves born not of rage but of purpose, of protection, of love made manifest in fang and claw. The council's army hesitated. They'd expected enemies. Instead, they were facing the first true pack in centuries, warriors bound not by hierarchy but by choice. Castor rode forward on horseback, bearing the banner of peace. Behind him came 5,000 warriors he'd secretly gathered from villages across the north. The council's forces were surrounded. The High Chancellor rode to the front, an old man with eyes like flint and a heart like stone. When he saw Sarah standing in her human form, pendant blazing, he understood. "The Pathfinder," he breathed. "She's real. The legends were real." "They were," Kyle said. "And now you have a choice, Chancellor. Stand down and we grant amnesty to all who wish to join us, or fight, and become part of history that remembers you as the man who tried to execute resurrection." For a moment, the old man's heartbeat faltered. Sarah could hear it, the sound of a soul considering mercy for the first time in decades. Then his hand moved to his sword. "For the council!" he roared, and his army surged forward. The battle was brief and terrible. Wolves moved through the ranks like death wearing fur. But Kale made sure no one was killed unnecessarily. This wasn't about conquest. It was about transformation. When it was over, the council's army lay defeated, but alive, their weapons scattered in the snow. The High Chancellor knelt before Sarah, his hands shaking. "Mercy," he whispered. "Please." Sarah stepped forward, and though she was blind, it seemed she saw everything. "I offer you a choice," she said. "Return to the capital and tell them what you saw here. Tell them that the old magic has returned, that the Pathfinder walks among us, and that the kingdom can either evolve or be swept aside by what's coming. Or—" She paused, and her voice became gentle. "You can stay. You can help us build something that honors the old ways while creating something new." The Chancellor wept. His heartbeat, which Sarah had heard racing with battle lust, now beat with something softer. Remorse, recognition, the first stirrings of redemption. "I will take your message," he said, "and I will tell them that the future belongs to those brave enough to choose it." The new capital was built in the highest valley of the north, where the mountains touched the sky and the starlight never quite faded, even in daylight. It took 3 seasons to construct, not with the speed of conquest, but with the deliberation of people building something meant to last centuries. The walls were carved from white stone, quarried from the sacred peaks. Each block fitted by hands that understood they were creating sanctuary rather than fortress. The temple at its heart was older, restored to its original glory. Pillars of black marble veined with silver, a ceiling open to the stars, floors polished so smooth that footsteps echoed like confessions. On the winter solstice, when the darkness reached its deepest point and the stars burned brightest, Kale and Sarah returned to that temple for the coronation. She wore white silk that moved like water, and the pendant of the Pathfinder hung visible against her bare throat, no longer hidden, no longer a secret, but a proclamation. The silver chain had been forged by the village smiths and blessed by the old seers, who'd begun emerging from hiding now that the council's persecution had ended. The crescent moon and drop of blood at its center caught the starlight and threw it back like 1,000 tiny moons. Sarah's hair was unbound, falling in waves of deep auburn to her waist. She wore no makeup, needed none. Her face held the kind of beauty that comes from surviving impossible things and choosing to smile anyway. Her sightless eyes, pale and luminous, seemed to see everything and nothing at once. Kyle knelt before her in the center of the temple, and as he did, 10,000 people gathered in the valley below, voices carrying up the mountain like a choir of wind and hope. The old seer who performed the ceremony was ancient beyond measure, her skin like parchment, her eyes clouded with cataracts. But when she spoke, her voice was clear as a bell struck underwater. "We gather," she said, "to witness the coronation of the first Alpha King and the first Pathfinder of the New Age, not as ruler and consort, but as equals, as the heart and soul of a kingdom reborn." She turned to Kale first, and he lifted his head to receive the crown. It was wrought from silver and gold, woven together so intricately that it was impossible to tell where one metal ended and the other began. At its center sat a stone that was neither quite black nor quite clear, moonstone carved from the peaks of the northern mountains, the same peaks that had sheltered them during their flight. "Do you accept the burden of kingship?" the seer asked. "Not as dominion over others, but as the weight of protecting those who have chosen to follow you?" "I do," Kale said, and his voice carried through the temple, down the mountain, into the hearts of everyone who heard it. The crown descended onto his dark hair, and where it touched, the moonstone began to glow with a soft silver radiance. Then it was Sarah's turn. She stepped forward, and the whole temple seemed to hold its breath. The seer guided her to stand before the assembled witnesses, though Sarah needed no guidance. She moved as if she could see the path that light itself had carved through the darkness. The seer lifted a second crown, this one even more intricate than the first. It was woven from silver threads so fine they seemed to be spun from starlight itself. And instead of a single stone at its center, there were 7 small crystals arranged in the pattern of the constellation of the Pathfinder, the one the old texts said had guided the first woman of that name to her destiny. "Do you accept the burden of guardianship?" the seer asked, "not as dominion over others, but as the gift of seeing what is broken and knowing how to make it whole?" Sarah smiled, and there was something in that smile, something that made even the oldest among the witnesses remember what it felt like to believe in magic. "I do," she said. The crown was placed upon her head, and the moment it touched her brow, the 7 crystals blazed so brightly that light flooded through the entire valley. It wasn't harsh or painful. It was the kind of light that a soul recognizes as coming from home. And then, in perfect synchronization, both pendants, both crowns, began to pulse with the same rhythm, the heartbeat of the kingdom itself. Kyle rose and took Sarah's hand. Together, they walked to the open section of the temple ceiling where the stars were most visible. Below them, in the valley, 10,000 people began to cheer, not with aggression or conquest, but with the sound of people recognizing that they had been saved. "I crown you both," the old seer pronounced, "as the foundation of a new world." The celebration lasted 3 days and 3 nights. In the valley below the temple, bonfires burned so bright they were visible from 3 provinces away. Musicians played instruments that hadn't been heard in generations, the old instruments of the seers, made from bone and silver and wood from trees that had witnessed the first age of magic. Wolves and humans danced together, their forms shifting fluidly between states, no longer afraid of being what they were. Children ran through the snow, their laughter crystallizing in the cold air like tiny bells. Vendors served food that had been prepared with intention, every dish blessed, every meal a prayer of gratitude for survival. On the second night, Castor found Kale standing alone on the ramparts, looking out over the kingdom his choices had created. "You did it, brother," Castor said, gripping his shoulder. "You actually did it. You built a kingdom based on what's right instead of what's easy." Kale turned to embrace him, and there was no tension in it anymore, only the deep love of brothers who had chosen each other again after betrayal had nearly destroyed them both. "We did it," Kale corrected. "I couldn't have done any of this without you. When you knelt in that valley, when you chose mercy instead of loyalty to the council, you showed our people that change was possible." Castor was quiet for a moment, then said, "I've been thinking. I want to travel south, to the territories still loyal to the old council. I want to carry your message, to tell them what's possible if they're brave enough to change." "They may not listen," Kyle warned. "I know," Castor said, "but they might. And if even one village chooses redemption instead of fear, then this was all worth it." He left the next morning with a small retinue of diplomats and warriors who'd volunteered to carry the message of the new kingdom south. Kyle watched him go with hope and trepidation, knowing that his brother's mission might end in danger, but trusting that it was necessary. That night, Sarah gave birth. The labor was swift and fierce, as if the twins within her knew that the world they were entering had just transformed and they couldn't wait to be part of it. The midwife, a woman who'd been cast out by the council for practicing the old medicine, worked with practiced grace, and Kale never left Sarah's side. He held her hand through the contractions, and she gripped him like an anchor, her other hand pressed to the pendant at her throat. When the pain became almost unbearable, she would hum, that wordless song of the Pathfinder, and Kale would feel it settle into him like healing. "I can see them," she whispered during one contraction. "Not with my eyes, with something else. They're so bright, Kyle. They're so bright." The first to emerge was a daughter, her skin flushed with new life, her hair dark as her father's. She cried the moment she entered the world, and her cry sounded like a promise. The second was a son, smaller, quieter, with his mother's pale eyes, eyes that seemed to see into the spaces between stars. When both children lay on Sarah's chest, skin against skin still warm from the womb, Cale knelt beside the bed and wept. Not from exhaustion or fear, but from the overwhelming gratitude of a man who had been cursed and believed that curse was his entire destiny, until a blind woman had walked into his darkness and taught him that redemption was possible. "They're perfect," Sarah whispered, and she was smiling through her own tears. "They're perfect, Kyle. Look what we made." "I see them," he said, though he was looking at her, at the woman who had been sentenced to death and had instead become the salvation of a kingdom. "I see everything, and it's all because of you." They named their daughter Lyra, not after his sister who'd served on the tribunal, but as an act of reclamation, a way of transforming a name that had once carried betrayal into something sacred. They named their son Soren, which meant starlight in the old language of the seers. In the weeks that followed, the story of their birth spread through the kingdom like wildfire. The Pathfinder had given the Alpha King not just redemption, but heirs, children born of choice and love, not hierarchy. The hope this kindled in people's hearts was almost tangible, a warmth that spread through even the coldest valleys. 1 year later, the kingdom had transformed entirely. The laws that the council had enforced, the ones that made Omega's property, that marked the blind for execution, that treated the gifts of seers as heresy, were replaced by new codes written in the language of recognition and choice. Omegas were no longer beneath alphas in social hierarchy. They were partners, leaders, warriors in their own right. Those born without sight were honored for their other gifts. The seers emerged from hiding and established schools where the old magic was taught openly, without fear. Villages that had been burned were rebuilt. Children orphaned by the council's cruelty were adopted into new families, given names and purpose. The old capital, seat of the tyranny, was left to stand but abandoned, a monument to what the kingdom had been, a reminder of why they could never return to that darkness. In Northmark, in the new capital Cale and Sarah had built together, something unprecedented was happening. The old ways and the new ways were weaving together like the threads in Sarah's tapestries. Ancient magic that had been driven underground was being taught alongside new understanding. Rituals performed by the seers in secret ceremonies were now celebrated publicly, stripped of shame. Most remarkably, the prophecy that had been whispered in the old texts began to manifest. As Sarah walked through the kingdom with her children, as she touched the foreheads of people brought to her with their wounds, physical and spiritual, they began to heal in ways that confounded the knowledge of physicians. A man paralyzed by spear wound began to walk. A woman who'd been rendered mute by trauma found her voice again. A child born with a withered arm saw it grow strong and whole. This was not magic of dominance. This was magic of restoration. This was the true gift of the Pathfinder, not to conquer, but to recognize what was broken and coax it back to wholeness. On a winter night, 2 years after their coronation, Kyle and Sarah stood on the highest tower of the new capital, looking out over their kingdom. Snow fell softly, each flake catching starlight and turning it into something precious. Below them, the valley was lit with 10,000 windows, each one a hearth where a family gathered. The sound of music drifted up from the streets, wolves and humans dancing together, their forms shifting freely without fear. Sarah wore the crown of the Pathfinder, its 7 crystals glowing softly. The pendant at her throat pulsed with steady light, synchronized with a heartbeat that was no longer just hers. It beat in time with the kingdom itself. Cale stood beside her, his moonstone crown catching the starlight. He was no longer the hollow man cursed by a seer's vengeance. He was whole, and more than that, he was home. "Do you remember," Sarah asked, her sightless eyes turned toward the stars, "what you said to me that first night in the dungeon?" "I said many things," Kyle replied softly. "You said you came to set a prisoner free?" she continued. but you thought you'd come to lose yourself instead." Kyle reached for her hand, and their fingers interlaced with the familiarity of two people who'd spent years learning each other's language. "I was right," he said. "I did lose myself. But what I found in that losing, what I found in you, was worth every piece of the man I left behind." Sarah turned toward him, and though she couldn't see his face, her hands traced it with the tenderness of someone reading sacred text. She felt the line of his jaw, the faint scar at his temple from an old wound, the warmth of skin that had learned to heal. "I was sentenced to death," she said softly, "because they feared what I was. But I didn't understand until I found you what I was really meant for. I wasn't meant to fix what was broken in the kingdom. I was meant to fix what was broken in you. And in doing that, I fixed everything." Kyle pulled her close, and they stood together on that tower as the snow fell and the stars burned bright overhead. Around them, the kingdom they had built pulsed with life. Not the rigid order of the old council, but something more organic, more real. A kingdom where people chose to be together, where strength was measured not by dominance, but by the ability to recognize another's worth. "Every Alpha King carries a wound," Sarah whispered against his chest, repeating the old saying. "Every Omega was born to heal one." "But not all Alphas let themselves be healed," Kyle said, running his fingers through her hair. "And not all Omegas know their power. We were lucky, Sarah. Or maybe it was destiny. Maybe the universe has been patient enough to keep us apart until we needed each other." "Does it matter?" she asked. "Lucky or destined, we found each other, and now we have everything," he finished, and kissed her as the snow continued to fall and the kingdom continued to turn toward a future that looked nothing like the past, and everything like hope. In the years that followed, the story was told and retold, carried by merchants and musicians and travelers to every corner of the realm. She was sentenced to death until she recognized the Alpha King by his heartbeat alone. And when two broken things found each other in the darkness, they became the light that saved a kingdom. The tale was sung in taverns and whispered in children's beds. It became a touchstone, a reminder that redemption was possible, that love born of recognition was stronger than any law, that the most broken among us often carry the greatest gifts. And in the tower on the highest peak, in the castle of white stone and silver, the Pathfinder and her king continued their work, healing what was wounded, recognizing what was lost, building a kingdom where rejection could become destiny and darkness could be transformed into starlight. The pendant glowed eternal at Sarah's throat, a beacon for all those still finding their way home. And Kyle's heartbeat, finally free of curse, finally whole, beat in perfect rhythm with hers. Two rhythms that had become one, two broken things that had learned to be magnificent together. If your heart beat alongside ours, comment and subscribe, because every soul that joins our moon keeps the flame of redemption alive.